The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Alrighty, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today. This is part 7 of the 12-part webinar series on the 90-day business sprint, hosted by Chris Schneider, the CEO and president of the Exit Planning Institute, as well as the awarded Thought Leader of the Year. A few housekeeping notes on my end before I turn it over to Chris today. First off, my name is Drew English. I'm the program coordinator here at the Exit Planning Institute. If you have any questions or need anything, any assistance in any way, please just let me know. I'd be more than happy to help you out. And then these webinars are being recorded. They will be sent out after each session so that you could review them if you feel like you choose so. So with that, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Chris for today, and we'll get rolling on the 90-day business sprints. So Chris?
Thanks, Drew. And good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. This is our webinar in our series this year on 90-day sprints. And I'm delighted to have a chance to talk to you in July here. I can't believe we're more than halfway through the year already. We are now still in section 2 of my book, Walking to Destiny. If you recall, hopefully you've read it or will be planning on reading it. Section 1 of the book really gives you sort of a layout of what is happening in the market and how it relates to business owners, things that you should be thinking about in terms of how to position yourself for what we are now in, the greatest wealth transfer in history. Section 2 of the book is around what we call the 4 core concepts. And these are 4 concepts that I feel were extremely important for you to understand and adopt and accept in order for value acceleration to work for you. So we've already covered the 3 legs of the stool, covered that earlier this year. We covered the 5 stages of value maturity last month. And today we're going to talk about the 4 C's, making intangible assets transferable, or a word that I've coined called transferability. So the idea is that we can only get to the wealth that's locked in our business if we're able to convert the asset at some point in our future. And as I've talked about before, 80% of a business's wealth or value is tied to intangible assets. And so we're going to concentrate on intangible assets today. We're going to go through the formula for value. Some of you that have sat in on this, on some of my webinars before, have probably seen this before, but it's a very important point. So I want to keep bringing it to your attention. We're going to talk about what makes a brand attractive. We'll talk about the 4 C's. We'll talk about how to measure your intangible assets, which is likely not something that you're actively, proactively doing today. And then we'll go back through the case study of Flexalloy to give you an example of how this applies. Now, those of you that have been following, you know how much I treasure the thinking of Wallace D. Wattles. And I often quote him. He wrote a book called The Science of Getting Rich. Again, I'd highly recommend that you read it. If you haven't, you'll probably have to read it 3-4 times before it really sinks in. But fortunately, it's not a thick book, and you'll be able to get through it relatively quickly. And one of the quotes that he writes in his book is that thought is the only power which can produce tangible riches from formless substance. And what is he talking about there? He's talking about the power of the mind. And even if you think about how our economy has transformed over the last 200 to 300 years, we've really turned into an economy. If you look at a company's product cost, you'll find that a significant portion, I'm talking 60, 70, 80% of the cost nowadays, is tied to intangible assets. So we call that intellectual capital. And one of the authors that inspired me on this concept, or really got me thinking about it, was an author named Thomas Stewart. And he wrote a couple of books, one called Intellectual Capital, The New Wealth of Organizations, And he also wrote another book called The Wealth of Knowledge. And these are really intellectual books, but the concepts in there are very real, and they really hit home for me because of the work that I do in my own businesses and the work I do with many other owners at trying to help them harvest the greatest financial asset that they have. And he summed it up, I think, pretty easy. So what is intellectual capital? It's the sum of everything everybody knows that gives it a competitive edge. So a lot of companies can produce products, but it's how they produce the products, how they distribute the products, and how they serve those customers, and what they do with the information and knowledge that gives them that competitive edge. Now let's take a look at the formula for business value. Again, it's pretty simple. It's cash, or what many in the industry will use as EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, or EBIT, if you're a service company, times a market multiple equals value. I mean, it's pretty simple math. A lot of times I call this chart the simple math chart. And it's also, you can also calculate value by taking sales times a multiple, which would equal value. But most valuations of business are going to be based on a recurring cash flow, which the industry typically uses EBITDA as its measure. I'll just call it cash because it could be different for different situations. So it's cash times the market multiple. What we've talked about in the past is owners can control their income statement and their balance sheet in terms of sales and net profit. You're in control of that. The multiple, however, you're only partially in control of that. The multiple is really determined by the private capital market, and the multiple will be different depending on several factors, including what industry that you're in, the current state of the economy, and those are things that you can't control. You can't control the private capital market. You can't control the economy. But what you can control, which is part of that formula, is intangible assets, right? That you can control. And if you can transfer those intangible assets, you will receive a higher multiple. If the marketplace values your intangible assets, they will pay you a premium for those assets. And all industries trade in a range of value. So they might trade as low as, let's say, 3 times cash to maybe as high as 8 or 9 times cash. And the question I often ask is, why do those companies, some companies get 8 or 9 and other companies get 3 when they're in similar industries with similar asset bases? And the difference is intangible assets. The companies that are trading at 8 or 9 are deploying intangible capital that give them a competitive edge and lower the risk in the eyes of the buyer. And the real key to accelerated value of your business is really managing the multiple. And what I've talked about a couple of months ago is your accounting systems, which are most likely giving you regular feedback on your performance today, are really focused on the left side of that equation. EBITDA, cash, and sales, and of course, reflected in your income balance sheet. But today, most owners don't get any feedback on the value of their intangible assets, which is really controlled by managing the multiple. Intangible assets can be classified, as we'll talk about in a second here, is what I call the 4 C's. And when you have an increase in cash and a corresponding increase in multiple, you get an exponential impact on value. It's straight math. And then argue, as we talked about last month, focusing on value should be your number 1 goal. In other words, focusing on managing your multiple should be your number 1 goal. Because if you're doing the things that improve intangible assets, human capital, customer relationships, structural capital, and social capital, you're likely going to be performing at a high level, and you're therefore going to be driving more cash and sales. But as I showed you in a previous webinar with the case of CWR, in that particular case, just focusing on sales and income alone does not necessarily drive value. So really, if we want to accelerate value, which is what we want to do, what I want you to do, focus on the multiple. Now, what makes a brand, to give you some evidence of this, what makes a brand effective? One of the things we could do, nice thing about public companies is we can get to the data. And if you look at Forbes' most valued businesses last year, you're going to find companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google. Of course, technology companies are way up there. And how many hard assets do they really have, right? A lot of those companies are driven by their knowledge power, their knowledge capital, their ability to help you be more productive, and their control of information. But then you have other companies like Coca-Cola, which distributes a product with a secret formula. Companies like IBM, McDonald's, Samsung, Toyota, General Electric, and of course, Facebook. Now, what do all these companies have in common? One of the things that often comes out is extremely powerful brands. And is definitely not a tangible asset. It's an intangible asset. The case I like to use is Microsoft. Now, this, if you looked at Microsoft's market value, at least the last time I looked, it had a market value of around $290 billion. But if you look at their net assets at their balance sheet, and I have, their net assets on their balance sheet are only about $60 billion. What's the difference between the 290 and the 260? I know it's 230, but what is that component? That component is intangible assets. That's what makes Microsoft so powerful, is that they're able to sell at multiple times what their net asset value is and multiple times what their cash flow is because of their intangible assets. And before I move off to the next slide, for proof of this, even within your own private companies, all you have to do is look at your own balance sheet and income statement. I often do this with business owners when I have them in my. If you were to look at your balance sheet today, does it really reflect the true market value of your business? Probably not. And if you were to look at your income statement and the net profit before tax, does it truly reflect the cash flow, the true cash flow, what I call the real number in your business, and the potential cash flow of that business? Probably not. And so even in our own balance sheets and income statements, we're not really seeing the true value of our business. And those of us that own businesses know, right, what gets measured gets managed. So if we're not measuring 80% of our value, we're not really managing it as actively as we should. We spend a lot of time managing our tangible assets, but think about it. That's only a fifth of what your business value is. And my guess would be most of you, or at least what I've seen, are not actively measuring the value of your intangible assets. And that's why I created Value Acceleration. Value Acceleration is a system which is focused on managing your greatest financial asset, which are your intangible assets. You get enough information on your tangible assets, but you're not likely getting feedback on your intangibles. So if you were to look on this chart, you were to look at the value of a company or its multiple, let's say, what you would see if you broke down that multiple is that maybe times that multiple is going to be tied to your tangible assets. All companies have tangible assets unless you're a service company, and you have very few tangible assets if you think about it. And intangible assets is not something that shows up on your balance sheet or your income statement, and therefore you're not getting any regular feedback. Value Acceleration was created to give us a tool to help us measure the value of intangibles, and we should be spending at least equal attention on that particular number. And I would argue most of what we should be doing, making value your number one goal, should be focused on managing your intangibles, right? So those intangibles I've classified into 4 categories, which I call the 4 C's, or the 4 intangible capitals. They are human, customer, structural, and social. Value acceleration measures the value of those assets. Let's talk about those. So what is human capital? Well, it's, a lot of this is common sense. Human capital is the value of the talent that you have in your company, right? All things being equal, the more talented your team, the more the stronger your human capital, or stronger your talent, the more value the market is going to place on that company. What is customer? Customer capital is the measure of the relationships that you have with your customers. Deep, integrated relationships, tenured relationships, contractual relationships, diversified customer bases, all are things that contribute to strong customer capital. Structural capital is the least sexy of the 4, but I think is the most neglected. Structural capital allows you to take all the other capitals and make it company property. And once you make it company property, you can sell it, or you can transition it to a loved one, a son or a daughter, another family member, your employees, or maybe to your partners. Structural capital is all of the back end infrastructure of the company, your processes, your financials, your strategies, right? Your information technology, your patents and your IP, all of that is structural capital. All the other capital sort of sit on top of that, and structural capital is what makes the engine go. And then the 4th one, which I added, is social capital. And there's aspects of social capital that are within structural capital, but I broke social capital out because, after all, we are in the social economy right now. And social capital really represents how the companies, if structural capital is the information itself, social capital is how you move that information, how that information flows within your company, the rhythm of the company, the culture of the company, and not only focused on inside your company, but then also how your company works within its community and what you're doing socially outside that community. And those companies that are actively engaged in their communities, that are demonstrating leadership within their communities, that are giving back to their communities, have stronger value than those that don't. So those are the 4 capitals, and I would say that everything that you're doing from a knowledge standpoint can be categorized into one of those 4 categories. Now, what I said is value acceleration is a system that allows us to measure the value of our intangible assets on an ongoing basis. And so let's go through the system of how we would do this. And to give you sort of the basis for how to score this, if you can score it, that means you can track it and you can improve it. I use a system called Common Sense, which I have called Common Sense Scoring. It was, I'd like to take credit for creating it, but it was actually created by a colleague of mine named Peter Hickey in Australia. And Peter is a software entrepreneur and has developed software around measuring the strength of your intangible assets. And I loved his system when I first came across it. And particularly, I liked the scoring system. And at one point, a year or so ago, Peter shifted the system back to a scoring of 1 to 5. And I immediately picked up the phone and said, put it back, put it back. The reason I like it is, one, it's simple, 1 to 6. And the other reason I really like it is there's no average. So you can't, when you're scoring, you can't use decimals. You can't say I'm 3.5. You have to go either 3 or 4. So 6 is the strongest, 1 is the weakest, and 3 to 4 is somewhere in the middle. So when I begin to talk about scoring, or when you score yourself on these value factors, What I ask you to do is start in the middle and ask yourself on a particular item, if I were to score my company on a scale of 1 to 6, would I consider my company, slightly above average, meaning I'm a 4, or slightly below average, meaning I'm a 3? And the reason I do that is it's too easy for us to just say we're average. We're about average. But if you have to choose between slightly below or slightly above, it forces you to think a little bit deeper about why you would move the needle one way or the other. Once you've decided which side of the average that you're on, the next question would be for example, if I'm a 4, well, how am I better than a 4? Am I better than above average? A 5 means that you're best in class, which means that you're up in around the 15, no more than 20% best in that particular industry. And so not everybody can be on top. That means that there's only 1 to 2 companies out of 10 that would qualify for a 5. And so you really want to challenge yourself if you're going to put yourself in a best in class and be able to prove, as we've talked about, right? Exit readiness is a state of fact, not state of mind. We have to be able to prove it. We have to have evidence of it. 6 means you can't do anything further. It's as good as it's ever going to get, and it can't get any better. And so I rarely score businesses value factors at 6, because I always feel, if we're being honest, I think there's always room for improvement. 6 is sort of an ideal to get to, but it's very rare that I would hand out a 6 because there's always something more that you can do. If you're on the other end of the scale, a 3 means you're slightly below average. You're around average, slightly below is where you would lean. A 2 means you probably have something, but it's just not that good. Maybe you've thought about it, right? But you haven't documented it. And a 1 means you haven't addressed it at all. And so with that kind of scoring system in mind, we can go out and we can identify the specific value factors that make up the 4 C's, and we can begin to score those items. Now, when I score a business, including my own, I score it on 151 different value factors in each of those different categories. And the beauty of that is, if you're honest, is that it really will not only show you what your current score is and how you benchmark, but it will more importantly show you what things you could be working on to improve your score. And we've gone through this in the past as well. When you score the business this way, right, you can then take that score based on your score and you can place yourself in the range of value. So again, going back to our example, if we had an industry, a company in an industry that was trading between 3 and 8, right? If I score below average, I'm going to get a below average multiple, and I can take that below average multiple, multiply it by my cash, and come up with an estimated value of the business. But again, more importantly, I can quantify that if I can move my multiple from a 4 to a 6 or a 4 to a 7 by improving these value factors, in particular intangible asset transferable value, I can quantify what the potential value of the business is. That's what we call the value gap. And those factors then, if I work on them, become action items that I implement on a 90-day basis. And as I improve those value factors, I can quantify the improvement in value of my business. And so it gives you an actual way to measure the improvements that you're making to intangible capital. So let's go through a little example here, right? And I do this exercise in my roundtables with the owners. I'll go to a board and I'll write down on the board human capital. And remember, I call this common sense. So you as owners, you know all this stuff already. What you probably just don't have is a way to score it and keep track of it so you can make it better. And so I'll go to the board and I'll say to the owners, what makes strong human capital? And if you were all in a room with me right now, you'd all be yelling out things that make strong human capital. It's common sense. Just think about it. So let's go to the next slide here. Human capital. You might say things like competency of my staff, the experience of my staff, the tenure of my staff. You might say the professional and technical development programs that we offer to keep our staff and our teams constantly learning and growing. You might talk about the way we measure performance, our review process, our scoring process, the feedback that we give to the employees, our scorecards and things like that. You might say, my people are, it's the measure of their know-how. They know their numbers, they know our products, they know our industry. It could be things like customer focus and relationships. One that I like to point out is owner independence. To me, if you've heard me speak in the past, to me, owner independence is the one thing above all others that I think is a good indicator of business value. If your business can operate independently of you, it implies that you have strong human capital because they can run and perform and excel without you. It implies that you have strong customer relationships because those relationships are with your company and your people and not necessarily with you. You might say we're an innovative company. We're developing new products. We have new systems. And on the right side of the equation, other things like the chemistry of our team, the professionalism of our management, the reliability of our people, and on and on. You could talk about their specific abilities. If you were in the room with me and I was writing these things down, we'd write down probably 2-3 pages of things, because owners, you already know what makes strong human capital. So all you really need to do is write it down. If you write these things down and you have them, then what you need to do is you need to go back using the common sense scoring system that I gave you and score these things. So if I was with you and I'd say, okay, we'll score your competency, experience, and tenure. Would you say your competency of your employees is slightly above average or slightly below average? And then, as I explained, you would go out from there, right? When I talk about professional development programs, right? How strong is that program? If you don't have one, it's a 1. If you do a little bit of it, maybe it's a 2, right? If you have a program but you don't adhere to the policy on a regular basis, it's probably a 3. You get the idea. So you can go through all of these different value factors. We call these value factors. As I said, I look at 151 different factors, and you can actually score these. And as you score them, you can total those scores. Your maximum score is going to be 6, and you can come up with an average. And based on what your average is, you can then take that average and then place yourself into the range of value, and you'll get a pretty decent idea of where you benchmark and whether or not you're capturing all the value and all the potential of your company. Now let's take a little example and go through Flexalloy. Now, Flexalloy was a company I worked for in the late 90s. In fact, Andy Rayburn, who was the owner of Flexalloy, is our keynote speaker at our summit this year. And I'm really excited to reconnect with him and have him share with everybody the successes that we had at Flexalloy and be available to answer questions from people. Because Flexalloy, working for Flexalloy, changed my life and set me on the path that I'm on now. I joined Flexalloy in 1997, and it was about a $90 million company. And for me at the time, it was a small company. And I remember I told my brother I joined a small company, and he said, "Oh, how much are they?" I said, 90 million. And he laughed. He said, "That's not a small company." But Flexalloy was a middle market, privately held company. Andy was second generation. He took the business over when he was a very young man because his father passed away suddenly, and he was thrust into running this company. And at the time, I think it was about 20 or $24 million. And he had grown it up to $90 million. And Andy wanted to grow Flexalloy rapidly and take it international. And it was a life-changing experience for me because I had come out of the corporate world, and it was the first time I had really worked for a middle market, privately held family business. And I learned a lot of lessons about family business from Andy. and it was a great experience. And I didn't know at the time I joined Flexalloy that I was part of Andy's exit plan. Andy had intended to exit the business or do potentially a recap over the next few years, and I was part of that exit plan. I'll explain that a little bit later. But we grew Flexalloy from 90 million to about 240, 250 over 3 years. We were a just-in-time fastener distributor to trucking and heavy equipment manufacturers. Now, that doesn't sound too sexy. Primarily a distribution business. We had a manufacturing component, but we decided to sell that off and really just focus on just-in-time distribution. And what we used to do is we would supply fastener components to these companies like Freightliner and Volvo. They're making these big trucks, and we would control the entire supply chain from really at the point that the part was engineered all the way to its point of use on the factory floor. And we would do that on a just-in-time basis. Over those 3 years, we had roughly about a 40% compound annual growth rate, which is twice what is considered hypergrowth. Hypergrowth is around 20% a year, and that's considered exceptional by most standards. And we were growing at even almost twice that rate. And all of that growth was organic. We didn't buy anybody during that period, so that was all organic growth. Now, I can't release the specifics of what we sold Flexalloy for, but if you take my simple back of the envelope kind of calculations at 50% of sales, you know, Flexalloy was probably worth roughly about $45 million when I joined it, and 3 years later, it had grown to around $145 million in just 3 years. That's $100 million increase in value over a 3-year period. That's more than 200% increase, and $100 million is not something to shake your finger at. So it was quite a successful endeavor. Our value proposition was reduce the supply base. So in the fastener industry in those days, it was a very fragmented industry. There were a lot of small players in the industry. And even though fasteners are a nickel, a dime, a quarter, you needed millions of them. And they were also, for these manufacturers, one of the top 5 items in the bill of material. So the last thing you wanted to do was shut down a facility because they were missing a bolt or a nut or a cap. And so just-in-time distribution was critical, but it was one of those components that nobody likes to manage. It takes a lot of time to manage it. And a lot of manufacturers, assemblers at that time were outsourcing their distribution to a company like Flexalloy. Now, we were a lot smarter, power of intellectual capital. We were very smart at how we did it. We were very efficient, and oftentimes we were lowering our customers' costs as well as improving their quality and efficiency. So we wanted to do that, though. We needed control over the supply base. We needed to improve the supply chain flow. We needed to improve quality. We needed to reduce waste, right? Just in time got us that. Engineer better parts, improve on-time delivery, replace their systems with ours, and ultimately resulting in being entangled. Oftentimes we had our own people in these facilities, which many were union facilities, and you couldn't tell who was a Flexalloy person and who was a Volvo person because they were so tightly integrated. We managed these bins right on the factory floor. And as I said, we supplied product all the way up to the point of use. So we would have people that would be on the factory floor using barcode readers to scan the bins. And then we had a minimum quantity that had to be in the bin based on production. And then once we fell below that minimum, we would send a signal back to a satellite warehouse, and then we would basically pull the fastener component all the way through the supply chain. It would go back to the satellite, back to the central facility, and then back to the vendor. And we were just constantly sucking parts through the system. And we would restock those bins every 2 hours. So we didn't take up a lot of room, There were never a lot of parts tied up, and we had a constant flow of material flowing into our customers' facilities. Now the talent, when I joined Flexalloy, Andy had already built a really solid group of what he called directors. There were six of us, maybe seven, sales, IT, finance, engineering, and operations. And the team was pretty well tenured before I had gotten there. In fact, the day that we sold, a couple days after we sold Flexalloy, Andy called some of the original people that were there in the company 20 years earlier and wrote and handed them a big bonus check based on the sale of the company. So the teams were already in place, but there were a couple of holes. I was fortunate to fill one of the holes. One of the things Andy knew, back then I was in supply chain and IT, that in order to scale at the pace he wanted to scale, we needed a new information technology system. And so my job was to come in basically and implement an enterprise management system that would allow the company to scale at the pace Andy wanted to scale it and take it international and re-engineer the workflows throughout the business in order to take advantage of technology. Again, intellectual capital. We had a flat organization, and the business was truly, at that point, already owner independent. We would meet with Andy every Monday from 10 to 12, all the directors. We would do a round table on what was going on, any problems that we had to solve, what we were going to do that week, and then we might not see Andy the rest of the week. And Andy spent most of his time focusing on building value and growing sales. The customers, that was pretty simple, ideal, one common goal, 99.99% on-time delivery. We were responsible if we shut down a line and the clock began to tick. So there was no way that we were going to let that happen. And it didn't happen. It happened, 0.01% of the time. I remember one time we actually took a box of fasteners, rented a private jet and flew it to a factory in order to avoid shutting the factory down. Our condition was that they had to single source all fastener components to us. So we took over basically all supply chain management for their fastener components. And that allowed us to dominate the supply chain to the point of use. As I said, we built these satellite facilities that were usually 10, 15 minutes away. And we had our people on site in the factories, of course, at the satellites. And that we needed to insert technology into the entire supply chain in order for this system to work. From a systems and processes, structural capital, ISO obviously was a big component of what we were doing then. Remember, this is back in the late 90s. There are other systems today. I like it when I see owners doing systems like that, because it forces you to document what you're doing. And that's structural capital. We needed scalable systems and processes. I had an agreement with Andy. One of my conditions was that I would get 2% of sales would be invested into technology annually. Now, for some companies, that sounds like a lot, but in order to scale at the pace we needed to invest in technology. And the beauty of that was that when I got the sales forecast, I could easily figure out what my IT funding would be. And then me and my team could go to work at figuring out how to invest that money to develop the company's ability to perform at the level it needed to perform. It also gave Andy and the chief financial officer, a good idea of what I was going to need in order to keep the company's technology running the way we needed it to run. We called our system Flexability, and that's really where transferability came from. The purpose of that was we weren't implementing systems. We were empowering people was our objective. And for those of you that work with IT or maybe in IT, you know what I'm talking about. It's not about the technology. It's about how you use the technology. And the purpose of the technology is to improve everybody's ability to perform. And so our slogan was flexibility, to try to give everybody the right message and the right vision as to why we were making all these technology changes. And finally, the culture. Never been able to quite duplicate that culture, though I've tried. It was a very unique place. We used to have monthly in the paint meetings. So every facility we had around the country had a basketball key painted in it. And once a month, the entire company would gather in the paint, and we would have a total company meeting. Andy would get up and talk about what was going on in the company and share his vision, recognize people that were doing special things throughout the company. And then we would do a round table with each of the facilities where the branch managers would have an opportunity to talk about some of the things that they needed, some of the successes they had, some of the challenges they had. And everyone in the company, all 450 of us at one point, would gather once a month for that meeting. It was a great communication tool and a great culture building tool. We had something called CARE Challenge. Customers always receive excellence is what CARE stood for. And we had teams have a little competition. Each of our groups were given a nickname. My group at the time, I show you how old it was, right? We were called the Hard Drivers. And we would have a competition where each group would have to come up with 2 or 3 ideas for improving customer relationships, and then we would have a competition to implement those changes over 90 days. And if you won the competition, Andy would pay to have you take out your entire department out to dinner, and he would provide limousines for the entire group. Now, I know that sounds very expensive, but we created $100 million of value in 3 years. So it was a great investment, I guess is the way he would look at it. We'll hear more from him about that at the summit. We had visual scorecards. I think this is a really important thing, that your scorecards are visual. So when you came into our facility, there was a board up on the warehouse that everyone had to walk by that had our CARE Challenge. We had horses up there. Each of the team names were up there. And as you got your stuff, as you started to get your stuff done, your horse started to move left to right. And believe you me, each of the directors, when we were coming in, were watching those horses because we were a competitive bunch. And we wanted to see our horses moving, and we wanted to win. The other thing that we had is we had our service rating was up there so that we knew what our service levels were from the previous day, for the month, for the quarter, and year to date. And one of the things I thought was unique is we didn't have a human resource department. Andy referred to all of the employees as partners. They weren't true partners, although I will after we sold the company, every single person in the company got a big check. It was really fun because like 2 weeks after the payouts, there were a whole bunch of new cars in the parking lot. But calling your people partners instead of employees can sound kind of corny and fake, and it is corny if it's not real. But people were really encouraged to provide ideas and to give back, and we really worked well as a team. And of course, we had a cheer, 1, 2, 3 flex. To give you an idea, we had a suite behind home plate, and every single employee on Friday afternoon we'd do a raffle, and we would basically draw a name out of a hat, and if your name got drawn, you had access to the suite for that upcoming week or next month or something like that. But the idea was that we could try to get every employee to attend a game behind home plate every year. Now, to wrap this up, the key here is transferability. All these things are great, but if they're not transferable, right, we can't cash in on the asset. We can't convert we have to be able to convert the asset. And so one of the 4 C's I think most owners forget about and don't spend enough time on is structural capital. We know, you guys know, human capital is important. You know, you're always trying to develop and enhance your customer relationships. You're even conscious and aware of the type of culture. But one of the things that I typically see lacking is structural capital, documentation of all of this stuff. Why do you have such strong customer relationships? What do you do that's different? Think back to my case study with CWR. They had great sales growth, great EBITDA growth, right? But the business wasn't ready to transfer because the owner hadn't documented and hadn't developed the people so that they could run without him, and that the knowledge capital within that business could be packaged up, turned into company property, and transferred to the next owner. So from a talent standpoint, I can tell you the multinational that bought us and paid a pretty penny for us, it paid much more than 145 million, was really, they wanted our talent. They were looking at us saying, what are you guys doing over there? You know, you have this enormous growth and this tremendous potential and this great environment and these high performing people. They really wanted our talent. And putting ourselves in a position, actually when we got acquired, I actually thought, because I had been on the buy side many times, I thought, well, this will be interesting. I'll be on the side where somebody's buying me instead of me buying somebody else. This will be an interesting, but when the company bought us, they actually put us in charge, even though we were the company that got acquired, because of the talent level that we had. And not to say that we didn't have our battles. If you talk to Jim Smith or Ed Zalaski, some of the other guys, we had our battles. But I tell you, as a unit, when the chips were down, we really performed. Customer relationships transfer. I'm talking about diversified relationships, contractual relationships, and relationships that are not dependent on you, the owner. In the case of Flexloy, they were not dependent on Andy, even though Andy contributed significantly to the culture and to the relationship. Those relationships were with Flexloy and were tied to our systems. If Andy disappeared, those systems would continue to run and those relationships would continue to perform. Processes and technology, you know, the idea of flexibility, the idea of ISO, documented systems. All our systems were well documented. Our processes were well documented. The company that bought us actually used the same enterprise management system that we did. The difference was their systems were horrible. They weren't working. People weren't using them. And our systems were rolling along. And one of the things that enhanced the value of the company was they said, if we could take, these guys have figured out how to use this system and how to integrate business processes with the system. If we could take what they've learned how to do and take that into all of our other enterprises and get our systems working the same way, you know, the benefits could be leveraged tremendously for this large multinational. And finally, does the culture raise the bar for the new owner? I mean, I think a lot of the multinational that bought us, they looked at us and they said, boy, if we could all have that kind of culture, we could adopt those kinds of things that they were doing, the in the paints, you know, the attitude with employees, the care challenge, and do those things throughout the organization, it would definitely enhance the value of our other enterprises. The key is it has to be all packaged up. And so what I'd look at, if I were you, is how well you're focused on building your structural capital, and ask yourself, is my talent transferable? Are my relationships transferable? Are my processes and technology transferable? And will my culture raise the bar? And can I demonstrate that? So to try to head towards the finish line here, exit planning. Let's look back at the definition. Exit planning combines the plan, concept, effort, process into a clear, simple strategy to build a business that is transferable through strong human, structural, customer, and social capital. The future of you, your family, and your business are addressed by exit planning through creating value today. Remember, exit planning is present tense. Exit planning is a strategic business tool that will help you drive value, income, and sales today while positioning you for a successful exit, hopefully on your terms and timeline. But even if that doesn't happen, you're still going to be ready and you're still going to benefit today. So stop viewing exit planning as some project that you don't have time to do, and view it as a strategic tool that will allow you to focus on measuring the value of your 4 C's and therefore improving it and packaging it up so that at some point in the future you can cash in on your most significant financial asset. So your homework or your action for this month is to score your 4 C's. What percentage of your total value is tied to your intangibles? Go to the 4 C's, go through the exercise we did today, just simply sit down with each of them, write down the things that you think make strong customer capital, make strong structural capital, make strong social capital. Write those things down, give yourself a score, total that up, and then you're going to have an idea of what the potential could be for your business and where you stand today. Our next webinar is going to be August 9th from 1 to 2 p.m. Back to our original time. And we're going to talk about the book, Relentless Execution. Because we can have all these great concepts, but if we don't act, if we don't implement, it's all for nothing. They're just great ideas that never get implemented. And so I really would love it if you either download or go back and read that chapter on relentless execution. I think that you'll see the passion in that particular section, and I look forward to talking to you again next month. I also want to remind you that we do have upcoming owner forums in the cities that you see. The next one is in San Francisco, coming up next, well, on the 26th of July this month. And then we have several that we're doing, a couple more out west in Scottsdale. We'll be in Indianapolis, Atlanta, Chicago, and DC, the capital region, to wrap up the year. If you have an opportunity, if you're in one of those cities or you're close to one of those cities, I highly recommend you make the investment and get yourself to attend the Owners Forum. You can find out more about that at businessownersforums.com. Thanks. As always, you can get my book at exitplanninginstitute.org. And I want to wish you hope you have a good month. And I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you. Over to you, Drew.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate you spending some time with us today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us as well. Like I said before, the webinars are recorded, so I will make sure to send that over to you later today. So just look for an email from me later. And if you have any questions, just let me know. I'll be more than happy to send it over to Chris, and we'll get those questions answered for you. But with that, we'll go ahead and end the webinar today. Hopefully everyone has a good rest of the day and a good rest of the week, and we will talk soon.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.